First, I think of myself, my mom was a science teacher. And so in many ways, my interest in science predated interest in history or writing. I had two older brothers, and we grew up in a rural area of Ohio, and she would always send us out collecting insects or snails and even quizzing us on the Latin names, the binomial names sometimes of the creatures we would find. I'm so grateful that I grew up in a time before YouTube or Netflix when we were bored. I think boredom was like a real important part of my childhood because we would just go outside, just in the summers, just from dusk to dawn, and be out in the world. Our bookshelves didn't have tons of fiction on them, but we had guides, like field guides to the birds or butterflies. And I think what she allowed us to investigate the world and not think of science as something remote that somebody in a white coat did. It was just messing around with frogs and tadpoles and bringing living creatures, bringing ants in. There was always this time when we would bring bees into the house, and she didn't worry about us making a mess, those kinds of things. Just investigating the world. And then when I went to college, I went to a liberal arts college in Maine called Bowdoin College, and they kind of encourage you to not necessarily think of, say, here's the literature building, and then here's the science building, and here's the history building. You got to investigate all kinds of things. And we had until the end of our second year to choose our major or our specialty. I'm not sure what you call it in Denmark. I just was so hesitant to do so. I remember going in to visit the assistant dean, and I said, are you sure I have to choose a major now? And she said, do you know the definition of the word dilettante? Which of course I didn't. And she's like, well, go look it up. And it's funny, I think, we think of that word as kind of negative connotation, like you just dabble here and you can't commit. But I think that's just how my mind works. I was just so interested. I took Latin American history, I took nutrition, I took astronomy, I took a whole thing about Eastern religions while I was in college. So yes, my major was history and primarily American history. And that did teach me really important tools about how to go into archives and libraries and look for like little kernels of hidden information or look for interesting photographs. I was still able to kind of continue to say science, English, literature, they're all just ways of asking, what does it mean to be here? And, how old is this place that we live? And so nesting human timescales inside of, say, these vast geologic timescales, that's kind of what I grew up doing, and I try to do in my work, I think. I think it's so interesting to think, the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and one exercise my mom had us do is take a roll of toilet paper and unroll the whole thing and map out the age of the Earth along it. Have you heard of this before? So you say, like single-celled life shows up, halfway along the toilet paper roll. And then, when do forests and trilobites show up? And you're in the last square of toilet paper before the dinosaurs and reptiles show up. And then you're like in the last millimeter of toilet paper before all of human history, the Caesars to your grandmother's cookies, all these things just show up in this tiny sliver. And when you're young, that has such power over you. It's not scary to think that you're insignificant in this vast scale of time. I think it's just kind of humbling in a good way. You just think, what a privilege that I get to be a part of this tiniest fraction of this long scale of time. Books for me meant I got to live multiple lives and visit multiple places. We didn't have lots of money, and so they were this inexpensive travel vehicle, really, in the beginning. The most powerful experience that I can remember is Mom reading us the Chronicles of Narnia, all those books, and The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe has such a great metaphor for what a book is. You open this cabinet, and there's this rich, colorful world in there. It's exactly what a book is. It's like this portable universe you get to carry around with you. Even though you can't articulate those things at 8 years old, I remember just being intoxicated by the magic of that. I would ask her, how did they do this? What did they mean? And she said, well, it's just one person and he's dead, and that was so powerful to you. You think he made this world that seems more real to me than my bedroom, and yet he's not here anymore. But by participating in the magic of writing black marks down on a white page, he's crossed the boundary of death in a way and crossed space and time. And so that this talking lion and this magical world these kids are experiencing becomes real to you as a young person. I think that was the original impulse, even though I wouldn't have been able to say it at the time. That was like, I want to imitate this. I want to try. So I was writing. I would use my mom's typewriter and write silly stories about my toys. I had these Playmobil pirates, and they would go on adventures. And like the power of quotation marks. I remember thinking, now I can have a character say swear words, or may have a pirate say "R" or whatever. It's just it just started with this imitation, this idea, I want to make other worlds like that with these really inexpensive democratic materials, which are words. Maybe 16 years old, I started keeping a daily journal, which I think was unusual for a boy. I think, it was something you more associated with girls, and I was kind of shy about it, but it was always a way to translate this big pulsing thing that is the world into language. I wouldn't necessarily write about my feelings so much as just something I saw on the street. And so when I got the opportunity, I was 19 when I went to Kenya, and suddenly the journal's entries just started getting longer because you're just seeing so much stuff that's different than your experience. And seeing Cape buffalo swarmed with flies, or we'd have baboons like come right through our camp, and they're so alien to me. I would write quite a bit about it. It's a way of encoding memory, and it's also a way of kind of slowing down your brain and processing your experience. So I think that travel and journal writing combined somehow really helped be this great apprenticeship for me. Reading, of course, is the true apprenticeship. I'm most interested in sentences that break the familiar, and travel is the most effective way to kind of break that familiar sense. When you come to Denmark and you're not quite sure, how do you turn on the lights in your hotel room, or exactly, how do I go get breakfast this morning? It's just a tiny bit more challenging than at home. That's good. That reminds you of, you don't want to sleepwalk through your life. I got into literature. I think my favorite art is art that allows you to wake up to the beauty and a dazzling amazement of being alive. It goes back to that timeline, to remember that you're so lucky to get to be a part of this huge, long roll of toilet paper that is the age of the earth. And so I want my sentences and my work to kind of help a reader feel that, to wake us up to like the awe of being here, Where I grew up, becoming a writer wasn't really something you would say out loud. I'm so thankful that I had two older brothers, and I think my parents had a little more pressure on them to go get jobs that made money. And I never met a novelist. I didn't go to any literary festivals. I just kind of assumed writers were dead or lived in Buenos Aires or somewhere, Paris. I got that history degree probably because I was too shy to say I really wanted to write stories, because I was writing stories in notebooks all through university and not really showing them to anybody. So it took until I think I was 23, and I was working as a cook in a restaurant in a ski area in Colorado called Telluride, and a friend and I decided to go to New Zealand for a year. And I just thought I'm always going to regret it if I don't try this a little more seriously. So for that year in New Zealand, I found I was just reading more than my friends and other people my age, and just started writing stories. And thankfully there's this thing called an MFA program, a Master's in Fine Arts, that allowed me to kind of tell my parents that I was doing something that they would understand, graduate school. And those 2 years, I think I must have been 25 and 26 then, that helped me kind of build a practice. I had worked just enough to appreciate what a privilege it is to get up in the morning and read and write all day. I really took advantage of those 2 years and started trying to publish in magazines. I was also lucky in that print magazines really still had a life then. People read fiction in magazines, and you could make a little bit of money doing that. So that's kind of how I got started in terms of a career. I think I'm lucky versus some people who come to me maybe in their 50s and they want to get started in writing, but they're used to having a car that works and having an apartment with air conditioning or something. And I was so lucky, I could live on very little money and just write these stories and try to get my little career off the ground. For me, a good book, there is no recipe that says one book should be like this. But in my case, I think a mixture of meticulous research and imagination somehow have to work in concert together. I love to research. In fact, often it's a kind of procrastination for me. If I get stuck, I'm not sure what a character will do in a certain moment, I'll find myself just until lunch, I'm just reading or looking at old pictures of things. In the newer novel, Cloud Cuckoo Land, I'm writing about the 15th century, and so All the Light We Cannot See, set primarily in the early 1940s and late 1930s, there's a mountain of information. Somebody told me when I was working on that book that if you took all the books written about World War II and ripped out all the pages and dumped them on Germany, it would cover the entire country. So at first you're like, why does one more book need to be added to this pile? But there was just a wealth of information. I could read about studies about the influence of radio and anti-Semitism, or I could look at images of the invasion of Paris in June of 1940 and try to understand what this character Marie is going through. Or what is Marie going to eat or buy with ration tickets during the occupation of Saint-Malo? I could find diaries that would explain what people were eating. So the 15th century presented this whole new challenge to me where, what kind of footwear would Anna wear, or what did she have for lunch or dinner? These things were so much more difficult to find. But there's this moment when you can say, well, when history's giving you these gaps, as long as you're responsible, imagination can sometimes fill them in. And so in some ways it was a little more freeing, especially when I was writing about the bombing of Saint-Malo in 1944. There were people who I would meet who survived this bombing, and you feel so much obligation to make sure these details are correct. So when you're writing about 1450, I had a little more freedom about, what kind of education systems there might be, how much inequality, is there literacy available to a young girl? Some of this stuff could just be freely invented. I had a great time, really. I enjoyed looking through old chronicles, really any description of the siege of, this Ottoman army coming to the walls of Constantinople in 1453 with these enormous cannons. This moment in history when we have the printing press about to arrive, this German goldsmith is inventing this printing press, the magnetic needle, the compass is arriving around the same time. And now these walls of Constantinople, which have protected books for 1,000 years as these copies are decaying all over North Africa and Europe, 75% of these ancient Greek texts that we have today were only preserved because of the walls of Constantinople. Here comes gunpowder and these huge bombards with this sultan, this enormous Ottoman army to crack open this old technology of walls. And these manuscripts are about to spill out into the Arab intellectual worlds and the European intellectual worlds. And suddenly the wisdom of these ancient people is now going to spill into the world once again. Such an interesting time. So I would just fall in love with doing that research and trying to get those details for my reader. All the Light We Cannot See took 10 years to write, and then this new one, Cloud Cuckoo Land, took 7 years to write. And I've been a parent for 17 years, so there's something subconscious happening in me about these two novels about young people being written as I watch my own sons grow up. And the structures of both books involve things in which you don't think are immediately related, and you hopefully as a reader try to guess how they might be related, and hopefully there's some pleasure when you reach the end of the novel and feeling how these unexpected ways in which they kind of combine and intermesh. Science, especially the past 10 years, science has been teaching us over and over that these things that we think are unconnected are actually deeply connected, and you don't readily think of them as connected. Climate science in particular, say, the Gulf Stream we think of as, the Gulf Stream is this current of warm water up the east coast of the United States. It's 100 times more powerful than the Amazon River, and it really keeps temperatures stable in places like the Faroe Islands or in the UK or in Florida. And it's slowing down really quickly right now, and we think it's because all this fresh water is melting off the Greenland ice sheet, and all this fresh water is getting to the salt water and disrupting density differences in the ocean. It's such a reminder that, like, the air conditioning I might turn on in Idaho is somehow connected to the weather in London and the weather in Tampa Bay and the ice in Greenland, and the way we're learning about this microbiome in our guts and how not only our digestive health, but maybe our mental health is tied to this huge teeming wilderness that we carry inside of us everywhere we go. And we think of ourselves as like these independent beings. And like on weekends, we go into nature or something. But nature's with us all the time. The pandemic may also be a reminder of this. That there's viruses from animal populations that are constantly spilling into human populations. Science is always trying to say things that you think are unconnected actually are deeply intertwined. And I'm trying to build novels, I think, it's not always conscious, but I'm trying to build novels that mimic that vast kind of unexpected interconnectedness. When we were kids, forests were sold to us or explained to us as kind of capitalism, right? Like each tree competes against every other tree and the tallest trees win. And now we're learning they're really cooperative and they're sending nutrients and signals to one another through mycelium, through these little tiny threads between fungus. There's symbiosis kind of everywhere. And the more we can remember, I think, that sense of interdependence, and the more we can remember that we're all in this fragile little boat of Earth together, I think that the better that is for the species. So there might be a moral element to these kinds of structures too, to say, here's a German boy, here's a French girl. You may not think they're going to intersect, but their lives are actually quite connected. I think as you get older, you realize the world teems with horrors and history teems with horrors. And there's something called I'm going to get the name wrong, but in English I think it's called the end of history illusion, where each generation feels like they're living at the end of the world. And of course, humans have kept going, and history has kept going all this time. I worry about our kids feeling like they're living at the end of times right now, with the climate change and the invasion of Ukraine, all these things intersecting. But I think the continuity, what I'm trying to somehow explain through that story, the continuity of storytelling through history, accurate storytelling, is to somehow marry the sublime and the horrific all at once. And for me, the best Greek stories do that. The Iliad is full of all these images of weaving and severing. Helen weaving inside the walls, or in the Odyssey, Penelope weaving all the time and unweaving at night. There's all this imagery of this kind of really abrupt, violent severing, Achilles slashing his way through armies, and then there's this almost beauty of like stitching things together. There's a lot of attention to fabric in the Iliad and the women of Troy making these really beautiful garments. I think there's something about literature that's unique in its ability to kind of embrace that dialectic, that side of both bright and dark and good and evil. And in all the light we cannot see, I'm trying to almost overstuff the language with these metaphors of light and dark. And in Cloud Cuckoo Land, this idea of regrowth and destruction, I think, to try to say, each generation has its dreaming of better places. So there's always this tension of like utopia and dystopia moving through the book. The center line of this novel, Cloud Cuckoo Land, is this old Greek manuscript that I invent. I invent 24 pieces of it. And there's a silly shepherd at the center of it who longs for this better place. He sees Aristophanes play the birds, glimpses Cloud Cuckoo Land, one of the first Western utopias, and thinks, I want to be there. And so he leaves his life and tries to transform himself into a bird so he can fly to this better world. So many Western stories take the shape of a circle, and the journey of this silly shepherd is that, he keeps getting stymied on his way to Cloud Cuckoo Land, but when he finally arrives, it's not necessarily as great as he thinks, like so many utopian stories. And he misses home almost immediately. I think it's my middle-aged lesson to myself as much as to my readers to say, this right now is as young as we're going to get. This is as mobile as we're going to get. And I just want to try to, rather than long for better and different things, the way capitalism's always trying to teach us dissatisfaction with what we have. So if you can just buy one more jacket or get to Bora Bora, then you'll be happier. To try to say to myself, what can I accept in life about decay? And what can I accept in life about the joy of watching your children grow older and become more capable as you become less capable, and your parents become less capable, or your parents die? That's the journey of humans, is that we're one link in this chain, and hopefully a continuous chain the continuity of it is quite fragile. The continuity of culture. What Louisiana is doing is allowing this continuity of culture to continue, and it's not for us, it's for the next generation. And I think the best stories are the ones that get retold enough so that the next generation can see something new in each. The whole project of this novel is to try to explore stewardship, in a sense. What does it mean to care for stories, to care for one little old book? And what kind of butterfly effect would that have long after we're gone? These little acts of protection and stewardship that we can take now will affect generations in ways that we can't predict right now, that our imaginations can't really comprehend because it's too complicated. So it ties in with our earlier conversation about interconnectedness. I think there's this vast mesh of history, and each time you make a positive action, you do kind of tremble the threads in the right direction, I think. So I hope that in some small way together we're participating in that. When I was 14, my grandmother came to live with us. She had been diagnosed with a disease I had never heard of called Alzheimer's disease. And over the ensuing months, we watched this disease just chew away at everything that was my grandmother, her ability to care for herself, her ability to even feed herself. If there was a time she could beat me in card games, but she still had no idea who I was. And I think my entire adult life since then, I've been fearful or profoundly aware of the fragility of memory because of that experience, that this woman's entire history could be erased, in a sense, so quickly by this disease, has kind of made me really acutely aware of the preciousness of how important memory is. Researching all the light we can't see, once you start diving into the Second World War, you realize all the seeds of the Second World War were planted in the First World War. And you speed on a train across fields that in the First World War, so many human beings died over 100 yards or 100 meters. And now they're just fields, and the world has kind of healed over so much of that trauma in a way. And I think the world needs to, for us to go on, because otherwise you just live in the trauma of all these things human beings have done to each other, from Hiroshima on backwards to all these wars we've had over things that we can't even remember why we fought these wars. So there is something really important about forgetting, and yet I'm so afraid of that forgetting, I think because of my experience with my grandmother, that I'm in love with the idea that stories can provide some continuity through time, because if we forget our histories, we repeat them, as everybody knows. And so it's so important to remember that, say, the atrocities of the Second World War were not that far away. And it's too easy to say, oh, those were just evil people. They were just doing evil things. That'll never happen again, because they were people exactly like us, and there were just certain circumstances and control of technology and information that allowed certain people to believe that they were doing the right thing when they may not have been doing the right thing. So there is this tension between forgetting and memory all the time. And if you think of that in your own life, of course, there are times when you've behaved poorly, and sometimes you kind of forget that and recast your own story so that you don't have to live with some of the pain that you've caused other people. And I think my work is always asking questions about what is memory. Even my fourth book, called Memory Wall, is really a series of stories really with what is memory as the question at the center, and they're kind of 6 different windows on that exact question, trying to use storytelling to explore what memory means and how it composes everything that is the self. It's probably unfashionable now to suggest that literature is an empathy machine, but I still believe it. I think it's a little old-fashioned now. It's people worry, I think it's a little too easy, because some experiences are truly difficult to understand. What's the German word? Umwelt, does that sound right? Yeah, there's certain things that you just can never totally transcend your own experience, but I believe it's so worth the effort. I think we're trapped within these confines of our own skulls. In terms of my own, say, mental health, I'm if I get a little awry, I realize it's probably because I finished a novel and I haven't quite found the next novel I'm reading that I really enjoy. Because I find I'm truly happy if I'm living my own life, I'm in a book, I'm engaged writing a book, and I'm reading a book. And all three kind of work in concert to help me live kind of three multiple lives all at once. Almost every reader I've ever met, they're training their imagination to step outside themselves, and they become kinder people because of it, I think. You realize that people across cultures and across time cry for the same reasons. Humor doesn't always translate, but sometimes it does as well, and we laugh often for the same reasons. But this sense that you're not alone in your experience, for me, so much of that came from reading. You know, when you're 16 years old and you're reading about a character who has trouble sleeping or something, and you're like, I do that. I have trouble sleeping. I'm going to synchronize my breathing with my heartbeat, or whatever some character tries. Or your character feels lost, or is falling in love and is confused. You're like, oh, I felt those same things. You feel recognized in a book when a character's going through something you went through too. And so, of course, I believe that it's so important. And the imagination is a muscle, exactly like you said. And the more we can exercise that muscle, I think the better off we're going to be.